Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to this panel discussion on the problem of loneliness, research and existential meanings, potential existential meanings. I'm Chris Bradshaw, and I'll be facilitating our discussion. What I'd like to do is first a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this conversation and it will go on YouTube and social media. You should have got a notification kind of checking off on that. So just to be aware of that. And I think I'm also going to send out, I'll do a blind CC email so that your email is still private, but I'll send an email with references that the panelists use or draw from. And if anyone else brings up other things, if people have references they want to put in the chat, I'll send out an email about that. The format is the panelists are each going to talk for a few minutes, anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes, kind of solo on our take on loneliness, research, existential meaning. Then the panel will have a free-flowing discussion for about 20 minutes. And then we want to open it up to everyone for a good 45 minutes of dialogue and connection. And if we could ask folks to kind of be on mute unless you're talking. And then when we do the discussion, maybe we could raise our hands so that it's easier. Zoom can get wonky if people start talking too much at the same time, and it's hard to track that. I want to comment on why I do these events. And my goal is really to kind of move and inspire myself to kind of work on myself and to hopefully help move others to do the same, to get intrigued by psychological ideas. I'm a licensed counselor in Arizona, and I spent a long time working in mental health, feeling a little bit isolated. Like I had all these great colleagues who I didn't always get to talk to about interesting, meaty stuff. You know, we spent a lot of time with kind of mundane day-to-day trying to get by stuff. So it's important to me to have these discussions. And I had a great philosophy professor, Jacob Needleman, who said a conversation can be a moral event and it can be a transformative event if both parties are willing to listen deeply and respect each other and really hear each other. And so that's kind of the spirit that I'm coming to this from. We're definitely not going to be able to exhaustively cover the subject of loneliness because it's pretty deep. But I'll jump in and like I said, we're each going to introduce ourselves and then give our kind of little initial solo on loneliness. So like I said, I'm Chris. I'm a counselor in Arizona. I'm a PhD candidate in clinical psychology, specializing in existential humanistic therapy. I also practice some somatic types of therapy, and I do some dream work, some depth-oriented dream analysis work, and some other things. I've been in the field about 15 years in different capacities. And I want to start with something that might be a little bit obvious, maybe to a lot of us, maybe not, but you know, the Surgeon General came out with a report in 2023. The United States Surgeon General came out with a report in 2023 about the epidemic of loneliness and isolation, and what is sometimes called the crisis of disconnection. And by the way, if you haven't already noticed, you're going to be hearing chimes when people are admitted. So we'll just kind of pretend it's like a percussion thing or something. But so I'm going to start off with a definition of loneliness that the Surgeon General, U.S. Surgeon General, gave, even though I think we all probably know what loneliness is. But he says, a subjective, distressing experience that results from perceived isolation or inadequate meaningful connections, where inadequate refers to the discrepancy or unmet need between an individual's preferred and actual experience. And I think one thing we'll see when we hear from Dr. Danvers is his research showed in part that loneliness isn't necessarily about how much you're with people. You could be with people a lot or a little and not necessarily be lonely or not necessarily be lonely. The Surgeon General cites some studies indicating that loneliness is essentially a stress in the body. It increases risk of cardiovascular disease by 29%. increases risk for dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety, premature death. He likens it to hunger or thirst, a sense that something is missing that we need for survival. And I think there's obvious evolutionary reasons why we need connection for survival. He states that it's similar to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, loneliness, that it has a real impact on the body. And he sees it as contributing to our society splintering, dividing, polarizing, and decaying. So he sees it as a sign that modern society is decaying and it really needs to be reversed. He makes some practical suggestions that we can go into. But he states that loneliness has an individual component, a cultural component, a community component, and a societal component, and that he estimates that it costs employers about $154 billion a year from loneliness-related performance issues and absenteeism. And there's been studies on how it affects school performance and other areas. On the research front, there's a lot of research out there, and the deeper I dove into this, the bigger I realized the subject it is. And looking, I tried to do some introspection within myself, generalizing my work with clients, and also looking at research. There's a woman named Niobe Way out of New York University that's doing some research that I found really interesting. She's done some long 30-year longitudinal studies on late teens and early 20-somethings. And she describes that we're in a crisis of disconnection. And she has an interesting take on it. So she's speaking primarily from the standpoint of the US, but to some extent, modern societies in general, is she says that our society has become very mechanized, that we've been that society has also been masculinized. And what she means by that is not masculine and feminine in the sense of necessarily male and female, but that we have gendered masculine and feminine. So we associate masculine with the binary definition of male and feminine with female. But she says, when we think of masculine as connoting an emphasis on autonomy, success, career success, individualism, power, aggression, and what's known as hard skills. And she says that even when we try to say that that's not what we're valuing, that is what's being valued, and that the so-called feminine or soft skills, which again is not necessarily saying it's more woman or man, she's saying is being receptive, open, nurturing, relational, and communal. So that there's a cultural emphasis on success, autonomy, individualism, aggression, and that's really what's respected in many cases overall. And that's not what deeply connects people. So that's contributing to this issue of loneliness. And also she's saying in the US is part of the reason for our higher than average homicide rates and violence in some cases, other than in war zones in other countries. When you look at other countries that aren't in an active war zone, that we have a much higher homicide rate and problem with that. She makes that connection. It was as far as social media goes, because social media is often talked about related to loneliness, that we're more connected and less connected at the same time. She says that if social media is used relationally to foster deep connection, that it helps, but when it's used primarily for to be kind of obsessed with the self, obsessed with the image, and to get, affirmation and quick likes and things like that, that it's contributing to the problem. So I want to talk briefly though about, and I'm moving kind of fast, but I wanted to throw a few things out there, and we're of course all going to come back to this. I want to touch briefly on an existential psychology take on this, because existential psychology has helped me a lot personally, and I work with it a lot with clients. I'm going to read a quote from a great existential psychologist, Rollo May, from his book, Freedom and Destiny. He says, loneliness is such an omnipotent and painful threat to many persons that they have little conception of the positive values of solitude, and even at times are very frightened at the prospect of being alone. And he quotes Andre Gide, who says, many people suffer from the fear of finding oneself alone, and so they don't find themselves at all. So I think part of what May is saying there is that there is a certain amount of aloneness that we all have existentially. When we look at our relationship to existence, we're born of our mothers, and hopefully our mother doesn't have a exceptionally stressful life. She may very well. We're born of our mothers, and we're hopefully greeted by other people literally when we're being born. But we're the one going through that birthing process in a sense, that nobody can completely know us and merge with us. And the same when we pass away is that even if we're surrounded by family, they can't die for us and they can't necessarily die with us. That there's a certain amount of aloneness. And the existentialists talk about when we can confront that. So practically speaking, when we can turn off the screens when we're alone and sit with ourselves some, which may take some practice and some support in therapy to be able to do that, we can discover things about ourselves. We can get closer to what really matters. We can think of ways we want to be in the world, creative things we want to do that take more discipline and effort, but maybe create more satisfaction. And then we can go out in the world and we can relate to people in a deeper way, and our relationships can improve. So kind of a confrontation with aloneness and solitude can paradoxically help us have better relationships. If we're constantly trying to kill off aloneness, then what could end up happening is the phenomena of when we're with other people and we feel at all bored or disconnected, we immediately go to our screens. Or our partner would like for us to be able to listen to them, but we're finding what they're saying a little boring and we have to go to our screen, right? The existentialists would say that that has something to do with needing to confront our aloneness and our separateness. And there's a lot more that I could say about that, but I'm gonna pause there, and I would like to turn it over to Alex D.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. So just to give a brief introduction of myself, my name is Alex Danvers. I have a PhD in psychology from Arizona State, where I emphasize research. So I'm actually, I think, the only one of the panelists who's not a clinician. And during my postdoc at the University of Arizona, I was working at a lab that does mobile sensing. So the idea was to collect data on people when they're out kind of in their everyday lives. And the device that my mentor used specifically is called the EAR. It's the electronically activated recorder. So I had a cute acronym for it. And the idea was to measure people's social lives. So it takes little brief recordings of people's day-to-day life. It, samples there. This is actually the paper that I published on this came out of my work in his lab, and actually combining several samples where they would just sort of make brief recordings and say, how much time did you actually spend around people talking? And that's a pretty good objective measure of how much time you spend alone or with another person. And you can compare that to how they rated themselves on loneliness. And so for a long time in the research literature, there's this emphasis on the idea that loneliness isn't the same thing as being alone. So loneliness is the kind of subjective feeling, as Chris said. It's about like, I want more human contact, and being alone is literally just, I'm here by myself or I'm here with other people. And what we found kind of in broad strokes was that there's a very weak association between being alone and being lonely. So if you know somebody's time spent alone, the proportion of their day they spend alone, you can only predict about 3% of the loneliness scores. We also found that there's kind of this interesting curvilinear relationship. So the idea is that it's really in the kind of, if somebody spends between 25% and 75% of their day around others, then any of those numbers is associated with a similar level of loneliness. There's no strong association. It's only when we get to really high levels of spending your day alone that you end up having an association. So if it's like you're spending more than 75% of your day alone, then you get to start to say, okay, now people are starting to feel more and more lonely. And as they spend more and more time alone, they feel more and more lonely. So this is kind of, our research association. And this was kind of a back burner project for me for a long time in my postdoc. I'm glad I have finally been able to get it published with the help of some collaborators. And it's kind of launched me on a further kind of journey of reading about and learning about loneliness as a phenomenon. So there's a couple of like points that I want to raise, and then they can be food for thought and food for discussion. One thing is that I have found attachment to be a really important construct for understanding how people relate to each other here. So I work at Sierra Tucson, which is a big mental health facility. I do the outcomes and I collect data on people's attachment styles. And I find that those are pretty strongly related to their self-reported depression, their self-reported anxiety, and their self-reported PTSD. And I also find that with good therapy, intensive therapy, people's attachment styles tend to improve. And what do I mean? I guess maybe I should just give a brief description of attachment. By attachment, I mean the way that we relate to other people's in close, intimate relationships. The theory suggests that it grows out of our like parental relationships, the way that our primary caregiver interacted with us, but it certainly can change over time, and it does change over the life span. But what I'm thinking about here is kind of as an adult, we try and assess your overall attachment style. And you might say that somebody has a more or less secure style. And really the two axes that we think about are anxiety. If you're really anxious about, oh, our people are there for me, or do I need to like constantly remind them that I'm here, and do I constantly need to check in that they're going to be there for me? And then avoidance, which is kind of, do I not really trust them? Do I not really allow them in? Do I kind of keep them at arm's length? And so we find that over time in therapy, people do improve a little bit and move towards that more secure style. And some of the research that I've gone back and looked at suggests that loneliness might come from difficulties with attachment, right? Because the idea is that attachment is about how you connect with people. Loneliness is I don't have the connection that I want. And it seems like there's a relationship where it's your attachment style changes the way you perceive others. It makes you less likely to perceive social support. And then that in turn makes you feel lonely. And that can be, even though you're spending a lot of time around other people, the way you see them is making it feel like they're not really there for you. And so that's kind of a relationship that I've been thinking about a lot lately. I've written a little bit about for psychology today, and I hope we can sort of talk about that, the way that our attachment styles impact our connection, which then can make us feel lonely or not. Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Alex. I think Sushree, you were going to jump in.
That's right. Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Alex. I'm Sushree, and I'm a psychologist and a psychotherapist from India. And a lot of my inputs today on loneliness will be from the perspective of a clinician and what I see in the consulting room as a therapist. And what I'm going to talk about has to do with the existential realm, because we are trained as existential psychologists. So we are looking at loneliness and isolation from the lens of existentialism. And it's quite interesting because what Chris and Alex both were pointing out is the difference between being physically alone and the subjective feeling of loneliness, which means that if you're physically alone, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to feel a psychological sense of loneliness or isolation. And likewise, if you are surrounded by people throughout the day, doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to have feelings of loneliness, because when I am seeing clients, when I'm seeing patients in my therapy setup, these are people who are preoccupied with meetings all day. They are surrounded by people all day, and yet they are reporting feeling very, very lonely. Perhaps they're coming back to empty homes, empty relationships with their spouses and children. And when we are looking at what's happening, there is an interpersonal disconnect. So I'm looking at loneliness from an interpersonal perspective where it's stemming from a lack of meaningful relationships with your significant others. Um, it's also, I think, got to do with an intrapersonal sense when you're perhaps not relating to yourself very meaningfully either. As an individual, I think we are um, full of emotions, thoughts, various sensations, and very often we are looking at them as distinct within ourselves. And I see what's happening in the consulting room is people coming in with symptoms of very obvious psychiatric symptoms, which they want to get treated, like symptoms of OCD, panic attacks, to challenges of daily living or even marriage counseling. And they're like, let's fix this problem. Help me fix this problem of OCD or panic attack or anxiety. And when we dig deeper, we see what really underlines most of their challenges is this fundamental issue of the feeling of loneliness. They are either people who are finding it very difficult to have meaningful relationship with others, but when you dig even deeper, they're struggling to have a relationship with themselves. Most of their emotions and thoughts don't seem to be in sync. They're looking at them as very distinct and disintegrated. And as a therapist, I think my job is to help them integrate them and help them see that, maybe some of your symptoms of anxiety have to do with the feelings of abandonment or perceived abandonment, which has got to do with loneliness. Or there is a difficulty in making sense of your thoughts and emotions and bodily sensations. And when you look at them, what really is coming up is not your symptom of OCD, but a problem of loneliness or a feeling that I'm feeling so deeply alone. And then we end up manifesting them as very obvious psychiatric symptoms of insomnia, difficulty with sleep, uh, because most of the times, like I said, these are people who are preoccupied with meetings, they are surrounded by people, but they come back to an empty house, they come back to an empty relationship. And there are people who are finding it so difficult to sleep at night because that's when you have little stimulation. That's when perhaps you go to your gadgets and you're scrolling through social media mindlessly, hoping for some sort of interaction. But like we know, social media isn't very interactive and engaging either. I think Alex was mentioning one of the times when we were prepping for this session. I think, Alex, you mentioned something your wife was telling you about, which is um, we are scrolling so mindlessly on Instagram or on various social media platforms. But when you start engaging with chats more meaningfully, that's when you're actually using social media for deeper connections versus when you're scrolling just to oh, I see this post, I'm going to like this post, I'm going to make a very casual comment on this post, but there's no real engagement. And I think some of these problems are coming up, and I'm not sure what researcher you mentioned, Chris, but you sent me the link, and she was saying something very useful and meaningful, which is you can actually make social media platforms, you can build them in such a way. The researcher from New York, Chris, I'm sorry, I forgot her name, um, where she was talking about how you can actually make social media platforms, you can design them in such a way that they are enhancing interactions and engagement, which allow for deeper social interactions. Because ever since I believe Facebook came up, maybe early 2000s, people are people have lots of friends. They have lots of followers. They are engaging, but they're not really engaging. And maybe social media platforms can be designed where there is deeper engagement, and that would perhaps solve for some problems of loneliness, I believe. So I'm very interested in looking at loneliness from both an interpersonal connect and an inability to also look at yourself intrapersonally, which leads to isolation within parts of yourself. And I'm not sure how many psychologists are present here, but if there are psychologists here, they would agree that when there are disconnections among various parts of yourself, we see an individual dissociating. And when it becomes even more extreme, there is something that is called a split, leading to multiple personality disorder. And these are challenges which are very existential in nature. They cannot be treated with medication. They cannot be treated with any kind of quick remedies. They need you to look within yourself. And like Chris was saying, really sit with yourself and see how these parts can be integrated. So if you are having people coming to you with psychiatric symptoms, I would highly recommend, let's not get involved in fixing them quickly based on their symptomatic relief. Let's look at what's happening deep within them, and you will find an undercurrent of the fundamental existential issue of loneliness. And hoping that Alex L., who's dealing a lot with addictions and sexual behavior problems, can throw more light on the connection between loneliness and psychiatric challenges. So I'm really happy to be here, Chris, Alex, and Alex. I'm hoping we can have a great discussion in here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sushree. Alex Lim, I think you're going to jump in now.
Yes. Hi everyone, I'm Alex. Alex L here. So sorry for my voice. I'm having a sore throat, so it's a bit coarse right now. Right. So a bit of introduction. I'm from Singapore. I'm a registered counselor, and my specialization has been in adult ADHD and sex addiction. So, like Sushree, I practice existentially and with Chris. And when I work with clients with sex addiction, especially when they're actively acting out, I often would like to explore this sense of isolation and loneliness. And this would be a core topic that I would like to zoom into. Like what Sushri mentioned, there is this component of interpersonal and intrapersonal void. And I often find that people who are acting out, they tend to have a void either interpersonally or intrapersonally. Say, for example, most of my sex addiction clients, when they're acting out, they are also married. And they often share that they do not feel content or satisfied in their marriage. They feel that taking care of kids is a chore, looking after their wife is a chore, and they're unable to find the satisfaction in marriage in there. So my work has been to help them to explore phenomenologically how is the experience of their interaction with their loved ones. And often they really find out that the way that they interpret their marriage, they have been taking their wife and kids for granted. And as a result, they're able to take a change to really, rework the way they view their marriage. Some of my clients, they realize that a part of them for acting out is because that there is this whole inner void inside of them. And I do love James Bugental's work where he talk about the inner search. And often in my work, I was helping my client to go through the inner search and then look into themselves and to see who they are within themselves. And many times they have never ever done so before meeting me. And it's scary for them to look within themselves, because what if they see something that's ugly? They see something that they do not like. So my work with them has always been to gently guide them to look into themselves and find out who they really are. Um, Often I have one client, when he looked within himself, he realized how he has allowed his mom to shape him and his choices, and that he is someone that have gave up his autonomy um, from birth to adulthood. And at that moment, he was just sobbing. It's like, how could I give up my choice? How could I give up my autonomy? And look how have I ended up right now? And my work with him has been just helping him to decide what does he want right now? What is his future? How does his future look like? What is his plans? And just helping him to connect with himself, that sense of interconnection really helps him to get to stop feeling isolated, to really stop feeling loneliness as a result, so that he doesn't really need to act up anymore, right? So in my work, I often find that uh, loneliness is really a symptom of either interpersonal um, misinterpretation or avoid intrapersonally. Yeah. So I think I'm done with my part. I just push it back to Chris where we can actually have a discussion.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, so we wanted to, as a panel, talk together for about 10 minutes and open it up to everyone. Does anyone have the panel on the panel have anything you want to respond to or ask questions further about? I know I certainly do, but I want to ask you both.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sushree brought up the idea of the role that social media takes. And thanks, Sushree, for remembering the comment that my wife made when we were talking about this, where she was talking about, like, maybe the healthy way of doing social media is actually leaving little comments and not just like or not liking, just passively scrolling. And I think the idea of maybe like finding like a way of designing social media more positively is one thing. But I also wonder if just like more broadly, because I'm not a clinician, like how do you see people interacting with social media? And do you see people like having these kind of, does that like negative relationships with it? Does that kind of characterization ring true in your experience?
Well, I think there is, oh yeah, I've unmuted myself. Well, I think there is a very mindless consumption of social media. Very often, because it's available to you, and you're just mindlessly scrolling, there's no real engagement, be it Facebook, be it Instagram. I'm not very well versed with other media platforms, but my sense is there is no real engagement because there's so much information overload, I believe, on social media that you're likely to get so overwhelmed. I'm not sure how much of information processing is really happening. It's very overwhelming, it's very overstimulating, and very little engagement, real social engagement. That's been my personal experience of social media consumption, and I've seen a lot of people while that's what Chris was mentioning, while they're waiting for something, um, maybe waiting for their appointment, waiting for an interesting conversation or a TV show to come up, there is mindless consumption of social media. Or when they are feeling bored while interacting with their loved ones, you're quickly looking at social media as distraction, as compared to maybe sitting within yourself, sitting with yourself and wondering, why am I feeling bored? That's almost unheard of in the 21st century, I believe.
Yeah,
Just
Sushree,
sitting.
if I could comment on that, I know I quoted Rollo May earlier, but in Rollo May's book, The Cry for Myth, he has a section where he says that essentially that in our current times, because of media, and this was even less so in his time, but because of media, we're never far from another person's voice. And yet many of us feel like we're not deeply heard by anyone or deeply listened to. And this is something that Raul May brought up. I heard the researcher I mentioned earlier, Niobe Way at New York University, who's researching disconnection and loneliness, and also the Surgeon General, they all echo what May was saying, because they all said that something we can do to foster connection and cure loneliness is to listen to each other more deeply, which is a kind of very simple thing and also a very challenging thing, right? And to experiment with having some limits around the media use. I do know certain people that make a policy of not liking or disliking social media, but only commenting meaningfully. I've noticed some folks doing that when we're talking about the likes and the so it's interesting that these, I mean, the Surgeon General literally recommended his recommendations sound very simple. He said, answer your phone when a friend calls, share a meal, listen without the distraction of your phone, try to do acts of service, and try to express yourself authentically. So I know that something, yeah, so I want to pause there, but that's very interesting when we're talking about ways of dealing with loneliness and ways to connect with people more deeply. Yeah. Any thoughts on that or anything else?
Actually, I don't know if like I was trying to like take notes as everybody was talking, but one of the things that struck me about actually all of you, since you're all kind of coming from this existential place, is this idea, like I think of loneliness, okay, it's got to be about like how to interact with other people, but everybody was like, no, it's about you. It's about your relationship with yourself. And I think that's actually really interesting. I don't know if maybe we all wanted to talk about what that means, kind of like
Yeah.
not being lonely in solitude or not being connected with yourself.
Yeah, let me comment on that briefly and then we'll see. So like Yalom talks about, so isolation is one of the existential givens, right? So this idea that there's certain things we have to, my understanding, my interpret, we have to confront and have a relationship with. I get this sense that a lot of existentialists might say loneliness is about our relationship with isolation. And so one thing he says is there's interpersonal loneliness, isolation. There's intrapersonal isolation, like Alex mentioned, and there's existential isolation.
Yeah.
And so I think that it can be about the interpersonal too. Like I have, of course, as a therapist, I have clients who are lonely, and we think, of course, we're going to think, who do you want to connect with? What's holding you back from connecting? Are there something you talk about, Alex D, in your research is that loneliness might partially be about not getting the types of connections you want. What does that mean? Are there people in your life you want to connect with that social anxiety is holding you back, you think, or a fear of not living up to some image, or a fear of rejection? And so we work with that, or is it really figuring out where your communities are and scheduling in your time? So I think it can be both. At least the way I operate is both, that it's an intrapersonal thing and it's an interpersonal thing. And it's also a relationship to existence as a whole, because I think part of the idea is there's a certain amount of aloneness that we have to face in order to function at the optimal level and be able to be present in. We can't completely eradicate a sense of aloneness. I think that's part of the idea, but I don't know, what do you all think about that? It's a little.
Um, it's interesting that Alex D mentioned that that's like a common thread between what we're shared. Um, and that got me thinking about, oh yeah, I mean it's so given to us that we don't get to see that there's something unique, and I wonder why is it so unique? And I guess this is my hypothesis. Um, Most of our clients, when they feel alone, they are looking at interpersonal connection. Um, and because that's obvious. And for them, they might have not or not aware about the sense of isolation that they're feeling. And they're finding ways to, how can I just get rid of this? So in our work, we want to help them to stay with it and possibly, like what Chris has mentioned, connect to this sense of existential isolation that um, there's no one that can really fully understand us. And in this experience, how are we going to possibly accept it or make sense of this? And possibly the intrapersonal would be a bridge for us to help our clients to move from the interpersonal to the existential isolation that they experience.
Mhm.
I mean, that's this is my guess. Chris, Sushree, any thoughts?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering because existential isolation is, like we say, one of the givens of existence. And like Yalom would say, there is so much dread around uh, confronting some of these givens of existence, isolation being one of them, that we don't look into it as individuals. And unfortunately, I believe that the culture is built up in such a way where productivity, engagement are rewarded. When you are sitting by yourself, when you're idle, it's looked down upon. When someone is not productively engaged, it's not really rewarded by the larger culture, and that's unfortunate because we over occupy our lives. There is overfilling of our time, which leaves us such little time to even look at these parts of our existence where we are alone. Um, and I'm just wondering how how do you look at loneliness, or how do you look at boredom, or how do you look at feelings of I have nothing to do? How are we viewing such emotions within ourselves? Um, because I'm sure that the larger culture will say it's not really a good thing. Why don't you get going? You need to be on your toes. Uh, and I'm sure there is a bigger discussion. It's a more philosophical discussion around how the culture has been built up on consumerism, productivity, and engagement. But I'm just wondering, how are we viewing these moments of boredom, moments of doing nothing? Uh, because these are the moments when you actually confront some of your existential givens, including loneliness and isolation. Are we giving us enough time, giving ourselves enough time? We, of course, encourage people to meditate, practice mindfulness. Uh, but mindfulness also has come up with really strange things these days. We've got to do mindfulness in a certain way. Otherwise, this is not mindful. There are certain protocols to be followed. So I'm wondering, how are we viewing as an audience moments of nothingness and boredom?
I think we can open it up now to everyone because it's got perfect timing. We have some questions from Sushree and it's time to have a dialogue. So in relation to those questions or anything else you're thinking about on the subject or want to ask or comment, you just raise your hand and we'll jump in.
If there's no one jumping out. And I just wanted to mention that I just actually met with a mindfulness teacher, like to learn a little bit about meditation. And it feels very different from what you're describing, Sushree, in the sense that, like, I think of like being with yourself as something that is like a lot more of an active thinking process, you know? Like maybe I want to journal, maybe I want to like think about big themes that are going on in my life. And that seems very different. Like this person was like, okay, you started thinking about something, let it go back to you're just in the present moment, you're just in this kind of attentive state. And that's, I mean, it is a nice sort of grounding thing, but it's not quite the same, you know?
Mhm.
And I wonder if there's like a mindful existential mindfulness, which is a little bit more thoughtful or something like brain forward as opposed to just feeling forward. Sorry, other
Mm.
people are.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the hands I saw Kirk and then Alu and then Allison. Yeah, Kirk, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
very rich discussion here and so relevant to the struggles of so many today. The discussion got me thinking about the importance of what I'd call an inner home. And if you can develop uh, an intimacy and friendship with your own being, this seems to me to be integral to all the forms of loneliness that you were describing. And if you think about a home, there are different rooms in a home, right? So maybe one room is a playroom, recreation, exuberance, creativity, something like, I guess, what Alexander was talking about. And another room is maybe a quiet room where you're reflecting, taking time to, look over your life or just be, just feel the sense of being without doing. And then there are a whole other a bunch of other rooms, eating room and movie room, um, discussion, conversation room, love making room. So yeah, I guess I'm thinking of Rumi here too, the guest house. Can we feel more uh, connected, more comfortable with these different parts of ourselves? And of course, that takes practice and time being alone. And I think that's the difference between sense of solitude and loneliness. Also, solitude being a more contemplative and uh, connected feeling. And just like with friendships, if you don't cultivate it, you're not going to have very deep friendships. And it's pretty important to do that with ourselves as a foundation, because that's what we're always going to return to. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirk, very much. Alu, you want to jump in and we'll hear from everybody and then dialogue and follow up? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for what you shared. I specifically wanted to say, Shapri, when you talked about, no, I've written this down, where's it gone? And yes, when you're talking about this idea of fixing the problem, in the work that I do, I don't work existentially. I tend to work psychodynamically and then in a DBT way. But it is this, the clients I work with, it's how do I fix this? What skill can I use? And I was working with someone this week and I said, you have not taken into account your story at all. So you're just going around and looking externally when there's all this internal um, disconnection and a shattered sense of self. And so I wanted to say specifically thank you for that. That I thought that was really powerful. The thing I've been thinking about, and then this will lead to a question, um, is insight and the ability to have insight. I think sort of this learning to sit with stuff is so important, not just for clients, but for clinicians as well. Sort of from, I watched the last panel, Chris, that you did, and one of the things was, how are we sitting with things as therapists? Are we doing that, or are we going through the motions because we've been doing it for a while? Um, but with that comes the ability to have insight. And I think some of these conversations can be very academic. And I work with an array of people. And so sometimes I'm listening to us and I think this is fantastic and I'm really getting stuff from this. But how do I give that to so and so who I'm using words and they're not connecting? Like, actually, how do we make this practical? I like things to be practical. Okay, how do I apply this? Um, and what I've been thinking about is I work in quite a story-driven way, a narrative way, because I think that brings something that can be quite complex into. So let's look at your life. So if we're talking about sitting with something, let's talk about when you were a child and your dad didn't come home. What would happen to you when you were sat there waiting? And sort of bringing it into this place of, oh, I can understand what you're saying because you're using all these words and you're using all this philosophical language, and I can't get into it. And that doesn't mean that doesn't work for some clients. I think that does work, and so it's not a one size fits all. But I think, how do we make this practical so we can use this? Um, and then the other thing, and this is so that is something for you guys to sort of say, what do people think of that? And then the other thing is this idea of the different types of love, and different types of connection, and how to even build friendship. And the analogy I use is, I don't know what it's like in the States, but in England, you can have diesel cars and petrol cars. And if you put the wrong fuel in, the car just won't run. And it can be a bit like that with social media at times. I'm looking for connection, but I'm looking for diesel, but I'm filling up on petrol. But I can't figure out why I'm not working. Is because you're filling with the wrong things. And I sort of want to know what the panel thought of that as well.
Yeah, my initial thoughts are, something Jennifer O'Neill brought up in the last panel, that Kirk and Gaspar and I met with Jennifer and a bunch of others, was, do we really believe what we say we believe, which oftentimes in existential therapy, we sometimes talk about things like that, being present with someone and listening really deeply can be healing. And there's all kinds of practical things we can do as therapists that I think kind of like what you're describing. I mean, the basic answer I have to give is that when I'm willing to be present with the client, and when I'm noticing ways that they might be trying to gloss over something that they think is unattractive, but when they come to see that I'm willing to be there with them and that I relate to those parts of them, I think that's one thing. I think that's at least one thing. And there's other like stances and techniques and things for inviting people in. I'm liking the idea of what Kirk said in terms of inviting us to make a home for ourselves and creating a space in therapy where it feels like a home for being the authentic self, including the unattractive bits or the parts that society wouldn't approve of. Those are my initial thoughts, but I want to hear from other folks, and not only the panel, but everybody. Maybe in response first to what Alu's saying before we move on.
Well, I'll quickly jump in. I feel you're saying some things which are very important, especially about how do we make this practical, because the discussions can be so academic and cognitive.
Yeah.
And I think that's where Kirk comes in, because Kirk has been an advocate of integrative work, where we are looking at a client, we are listening into their narratives, into their stories, but also asking them to listen into themselves. When we are working with them in an integrated fashion, we are checking with them. How are you feeling as you're saying that? Asking them to connect more deeply with their feelings. How does this comment feel like inside your body? How does the story make you feel? And I feel this is one of the ways to make the therapy space integrative, where the individual is connecting more deeply within themselves. When there is a story happening, we are looking at various physical movements. There is an affective uh, element that we are accounting for, and we are verbally checking with them, how does this feel? How does this thought feel to you? When you said that, what did that feel like inside your body? And we would definitely recommend Kirk's book on EH and integrative work. And that will give you a lot of practical techniques, I believe, when you're working in the consulting room with your clients. And I hope that feels helpful to you.
I would also just mention my original topic in my PhD was emotion, and I think one of the things that I found most helpful actually in having therapy is this attention by the therapist to my own emotional tone. And I feel like I felt more seen and like more connected when, I would just sort of look down or something and the person said, "Oh, I noticed you look down. Can you tell me what you're feeling there?" And I think that there's a period of, kind of raw feeling or raw experience that goes,
Yeah.
it's pre-verbal, that's really nice to attend to.
Absolutely. And I think that allows for an integration intrapersonally within the individual, which is quite nice. You're right.
Maybe I can share. So my original training is in CBT. So very much schema therapy, contextual schema therapy, DBT, I mean, very much CBT-ish. And when I transit to existential work, I find that there is a difference in the way that I do therapy. I and I noticed that when I do a CBT way of doing therapy, I myself has become very, very cognitive. I was just focusing on the story of my client and how to guide them to somewhere. But I noticed that when I'm practicing existentially, I'm forced to use my sense of self, like what Alex D mentioned, that attunement at that moment. I noticed that you're doing this. I noticed that you looked down when you said that. Addressing the here and now as what Yalom has mentioned. And it requires a lot of my own presence in that session. And I find that actually changed the quality of the therapy from a more logical, cognitive driven to a more whole embodied experience. Yeah. So I mean that's my experience when I'm doing therapy. And I'll be honest, there are times where I went back cognitively. It's almost like by default. What do you think about this as you're saying this right now? And it's not the same, right? And our clients just respond to us back cognitively, and they're not connecting to what they're saying. That's because I noticed that I'm not connected to what I'm saying in the session. Yeah, and that's my experience.
Yeah.
I think Alison, Chris, is it okay if we pick
Yes.
up Alison's question? Yeah.
Thank you. Not so much of a question, I guess just comments to a lot of what's been said already. I think the Surgeon General's statement is pretty funny because like all of those things are ideal and there is no suggestion of how to do it. So I just thought that was funny, like in a sad way. But what this is making me think about, especially Alu, what you were saying, makes me think of the 7 attitudes of mindfulness and how to use that. I use that sometimes with my clients to talk about like how to engage with the present moment. Because I agree. I think Sushree, you said about like no one asking themselves anymore why they're bored. And I like totally agree. Because the minute we're bored, need something else.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, so that was all I had to say.
Yeah.
And just thank you everyone for what you shared already.
Yeah. Thank you, Allison. Yeah, there's something I wanted to comment on. I mean, I'm thinking oftentimes when I'm working with clients, and let's give the example that I have a client who has an artistic hobby that they want to practice more. But they find themselves when they're alone at home, they end up binge watching TV or being on social media and never getting to this thing. something I would probably do would be what we sometimes call in existential therapy, like an embodied meditation of sorts. So can you kind of walk through with me? Can we kind of close our eyes together, and can you imagine that you're home alone and you're going through this, and we really notice what it kind of feels like in them every step of the way. And oftentimes, this harkens back to something earlier in their life. You know, there's some like incomplete kind of wound of some kind. And oftentimes ways of working through this kind of present themselves that way by, again, like getting out of the cognitive realm, like kind of, I'd like to work on my artwork. It's very satisfying. It makes me feel better emotionally. It gives me confidence. And then I can connect with other artists, but I never do it. You know, I stay at home and after work, I'm tired and I go to the TV and then I'm depressed, but I can't break out of it, right? There's something going on for them physically and emotionally in those moments. And sometimes working through that in an embodied way is something that I've done. And another thing would be, I mean, it's really the same thing interpersonally. If there's people that they want to socialize with and they usually enjoy it once they go, and yet they can't get out of the house, right? I think there's all kinds of behavioral and cognitive ways of working with that, but I think there's also ways of in the room, first of all, noticing when that social element might be coming up with me in the room, right? If they're hesitating with me in any way, or if they're afraid of judgment, and if we can drop into those emotions and sensations and talk through that together, that's often where the healing is. I think when we talk about, well, research always sounds kind of academic, but also when we talk about existential psychology, there are a lot of big words and abstractions and stuff, but it is a very relational, intuitive approach often. Like I'm not sitting with a client talking about all these ideas with them. These ideas are ways of helping me be in the moment with them, but I'm just going with that. Chris D, you had your hand up, and then we have several other folks too. Please jump in.
Yes, I wanted to second Alison Whitmore's point about the Surgeon General. Great, absolutely. Let's do these things. How are we doing these things? Especially since we're not dealing with just a normal problem. We're dealing with an addiction. We're dealing with an epidemic of addiction to screens. So all due respect to the Surgeon General, and how do we do that? That's a big question that I have in terms of even just behavioral change. And also too, I just wanted to speak, we're talking about being therapists and how we're being embodied, cognitive interventions, moment of meeting. This is very, very hard work, right? And so I think of I think it's Janet Malcolm, a psychoanalyst who wrote The Impossible Profession, and she writes poignantly about how this can be the loneliest profession in the world. So our discussion makes me think of how much we're so present for people, and I'm sure other therapists in here will attest to it. I feel like I have the loneliest job in the world, unless I'm in a room of therapists, right? Because it is utterly, earth-shatteringly, soul-crushingly lonely at times. And I think that that is an aspect of the profession that really no one, not no one, that's a very black and white thinking, most people don't have a concept of. And that goes way beyond self-care or taking a bubble bath or like a deep existential loneliness. What do we as therapists do to integrate that so we can continue to do this crucial work?
Does anybody have
big questions? I'm not expecting any big answers.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Denise.
Yeah, just to go off what Dr. Ducey was saying, like I definitely agree that we're in a pandemic of like just completely being glued onto our screens, especially the way I think of it as when I was growing up. we didn't have the iPhone and we didn't have the iPad. Like I remember growing up and just having like coloring books and like toys, and then comparing it to my siblings, that's all they had, like an iPad, and they have no patience whatsoever. Like the Wi-Fi goes out, it's like a complete like chaotic tornado in the house. Like they cannot even tolerate just like a few minutes of like trying to occupying themselves. And specifically with my younger brother who has ADHD, it's much, much harder for him to like cure his boredom, because every option that I like give or any ideas that like my parents try to implement into his schedule, it's like, no, that's boring. I don't want to do that. I don't like reading. There's no point in it. Why do I need to go outside? Like all of those um, activities are just kind of like shut down because he grew up with the screen like in his hand, like, which is really interesting to see from my perspective, because I was able to kind of occupy myself and do all of like the, I guess, like basic activities growing up. So I think it's a really tough question to figure out how are we going to implement this idea of like curing boredom without like relying on our screens, and not just adults. Like adults are completely like struggling with it. How are we even going to tackle the problems with children and adolescents? So that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a huge question. Denise, I think a lot about, I had this college professor, so I'm 45 now, so it was a while ago, when I was an undergraduate, and he gave us a challenge of sitting in a chair for 10 minutes without looking at a device, where there weren't really the same devices, but without reading anything, drinking anything, smoking anything, trying not to daydream, just literally sit with a chair and be with yourself. And it taught me a hell of a lot. It taught me a hell of a lot. And you know, I will say that the Surgeon General's report is online. It's a large PDF. He does have some suggestions. None of them would be kind of shockers to us, I think, as therapists, maybe nothing too amazing, but he does have some practical tips. I don't know if I necessarily want to spend the time reading them off, but I'll send it when I send out the references.
Oh yeah, and I hope I didn't offend anyone.
No, not at
because
all.
okay.
No,
Just I'll read the PDF. I will.
Yeah, I didn't want to read his whole report. I mean, he you know, he says integrate social connection into patient care. So I looked up the section for health workers here. Integrate social connection into patient care, primary, secondary, tertiary. So assess the patient's level of social connection to identify those who are at increased risk or who are already experiencing it. Educate them about the benefits of social connection and the risk factors. Leveraging interventions, including community organizations, group therapies, and work directly with community organizations. So it's a lot of stuff that probably isn't, you know, a shocker, but it's also a very medical model of kind of, to some extent, like educate them about the risks and the benefits and tell them about the community organizations. But one thing he says is involvement in community organizations has gone steadily down since like the 80s. They're just less and less and less and less, and people are more and more. And a brief quote I wanted to share that I thought was a colleague of mine was working with a woman from Turkey. And she was from a small village in Turkey, and she was saying something that struck me when I moved to the US was, in Turkey, I consider my home my village, but here your home is your four walls, like it's your home. And one thing my colleague was saying was, he says, as humans, he was saying he thinks we have a bigger need for home than our definition of home allows. And when we're talking about loneliness as like not getting as much connection or the type of connection you need, and I'm thinking of what Kirk was saying about trying to be at home some with ourselves. And I think there's a lot of ways we can intuitively work with clients on that if we're geared towards that. because we're all talking about things that maybe we shouldn't underestimate what we're already doing with clients about like helping them to be at home in their experience, but maybe directly looking at boredom, because I mean, I think boredom can be a great teacher. I mean, I think a great teacher actually told me that boredom is really fear, typically, is in this moment, what do I need to become or what do I need to engage to not be bored? And what's getting in the way? So anyway, that's more kind of abstract stuff, but Aishwarya, you had I don't know if I said your
Yeah, you did. Thank you so
okay,
much. I wanted to offer something that I think it can be a point for what many of the positions that many of you have taken. I'm an art therapist, and then I keep coming back to the fact that anything expressive or creative or anything that's related to the artistic life can really offer that sense of inner home that Kirk was talking about. And even from just, the phenomenological approach that Alex was talking about, a sense of kind of, just sensing and feeling and being with, and then having a witness to your art piece, a witness to you making art or engaging in that creative process. It can really facilitate that, not only that interpersonal, but also that intrapersonal, connection. And so I find that really, really powerful. And then another thing that I wanted to add was, when Alex was sharing about one of the clients, and I thought it was very interesting because I'm always seeing and comparing cultures. I live in the US, but I'm from India. And so I'm always comparing the two. And the fact that when he shared about his, the client, when he realized that it was his lack of autonomy, since childhood, that led to this void and loneliness. And then what I also see in this, in the West, is there's just so much emphasis on autonomy, which is leading to this feelings of loneliness and isolation. So that was very interesting, just an observation. Thank you. Yeah.
what do folks think about that? What do you think about? I know the first thing Aishwarya brought up was the creativity. I mean, something I see with my clients is if I'm not good at art, then I can't use art. But oftentimes when people get past that every human being has some type of creative spark. It doesn't have to be something you're going to sell for $80 million or something.
Yeah.
But that there's something that happens that I don't know can help in terms of feeling connected to the self. I don't know.
Yeah, I think one part of it is just, expressing. And so what often comes up in an art therapy or an expressive arts therapy session is people that'll say, oh, I'm not good at art, or and there are ways to tackle around that. But I think more just the act of creating, the act of expressing, the act of sensing and feeling and just using your five senses, it makes you present and alive, not only to yourself, but to the other as well. Yeah.
I also wonder if creativity is purely just in terms of art, but one of the things that I've done in therapy is I had a client where they were really struggling to connect. And so I did had four chairs and I got them to sit in one chair and they talked to themselves. Then I moved them to a different chair and said they had to talk as their child. Then they had to talk a different aspect. And when they sat in one particular chair, all of a sudden we had a breakthrough because they had completely disconnected all these different parts of themselves. And when they connected to a particular part of themselves, all of a sudden we had a breakthrough because it was like, oh, this is what's been going on. And I think there's something about artistry in the therapy room and us having that freedom to. So I'm not going to draw a picture. That's just not, I'm not.
Yeah.
But actually, how can I bring art into the work? And the other thing, thank you so much for sharing that because my parents are Nigerian. I grew up in England, but very much Nigerian culture. And it's so when someone talks about autonomy, it's a case of I don't know what you're talking about. Because
Yeah.
I don't know what you're talking about because that's not what do you mean. I'm 41 and my dad still orders our meal when we're all together. And my wife, who's English, is like, "What's he doing? Shush! This is how it is." And so it's such a funny thing to see the different cultures and when people talk about different things and saying there's different starting points and different things. So yeah, so thank you so much for sharing that. That was spinning in my head in terms of cultural differences as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And I would like to add that, in art therapy, there's an exercise, or in any expressive arts, there's just the exercise of mark making, where, say, for example, you have a tool, it could be just a pencil, and you're just making marks on paper. And then when we look at it developmentally, right, when a child is just learning language, they're just making sounds. And then, before they write, they're just making marks. And the making marks, or even if you go back to like cave paintings and stuff, these marks that they made on caves, or a child making marks on paper, was their way of saying, hey, I exist, I'm here. This is me. And so, yeah, is.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention briefly, and I know I promised Chris I would actually do this, that I do an improv class with trauma patients here at Sierra Tucson, and I find that as a form of like artistic and playful creativity can really get people out of their shells. And there's a certain proportion of people who are just going to say, improv, no way, I'm not going to that class. But then there's a certain portion of people who start kind of like arms crossed, and then you start doing just games. I don't like make them like act out a scene. I just sort of like, hey, let's do a storytelling game. Everybody's going to add a sentence. And then you'll see them like slowly kind of get into it. And maybe they're being a wise guy, or maybe they're trying to be like a little bit, dismissive, but actually that gets a good reaction. And then I think people start to connect with that group. And I found that to be a really nice way of interacting. And I try and explain to them that now you're getting to know each other through your imagination, through your associations. And that's a very different way than being in a process group where maybe you're just all talking about like the most difficult things in your lives, the most traumatic experiences you've had. But you kind of see a different side of people, and it can be really nice to see the connections that come out of that improv class.
Yeah, and Alex is very humble, but Alex is actually a pretty hilarious improv comedian. And we do every year at CR Tucson, we work at a residential treatment facility, and every year there's an alumni retreat where clients can kind of come back. And there's some clients that have been coming for decades. They come back and we get together and everything, and we break bread. And Alex did an improv thing, and it like tore the house down. Everyone was just laughing, and it was just hilarious. But something I want to also say, Alex, is that you are one of the most adept socially people I've ever seen. And you did mention, meaning you connect with people and you and you move and you flow with things. And you said that you attribute some of that to your improv comedy. There's this ability that you have to connect with people pretty quickly.
Yeah, well, I think actually it's interesting when you think about some of the themes that have come up, but I think becoming really good at improv is really about becoming really good at listening, because the other person says like, crazy banana things, like, oh yeah, now we're pirates in outer space. And you're like, okay, yeah, we're pirates in outer space. Okay, what does that mean? I think from my point of view, like a really good improv scene is not about like just saying as many crazy banana things as you can. Like you want to say, we would almost say you want to have like moments of discovery where it's sort of like, okay, maybe somebody's going to say something that's kind of wild that their like imagination goes off to, but then like, what are the implications of that? What does that mean for all of us right here in this moment? And I think that's kind of, I think of play as a way to build skills in a safe environment. And I think it kind of builds that muscle a little bit for folks.
Thank you for sharing that. I think, Judith, you had your hand up a moment ago, but then we got into something.
Well, when you get to flowing like you do, I just, you start reading my mind, and I'm just taking notes because everything that I want to say is basically reflected. But one of the things about the 4 chairs, Olu, which I loved, because I use 2 tools. One is called the child in the room, where you take the client and you have them pretend that they're the little child in their bedroom. And it really helps build up confidence and less judgment for them, because it takes them back to being that little innocent, fun child that didn't worry about somebody judging them. And then the other tool I use is called the adult praise. So then fast forward, they take themselves out of just, the adult praise, maybe mom, dad, steps, whatever. They consider their adult, their main adult in their life. And it between the two and the middle is correct. It takes a lot of the the fears from just letting it flow. So that was one of the things I wanted to talk about. And Alex, as far as improv, I have used improv before. It is wonderful. And the yes and is that really gets them every time. And I've had meetings where now right now I'm not even licensed yet, but I'm gonna get there. The thing is, the yes and just is amazing tool. It really is. It gets people absolutely, it breaks down walls. People start laughing, the crazy yellow bananas, the whole bit. It's amazing. So I didn't realize you were such an improv guy. So, but that's it. So thank you.
Yeah,
Judith.
3 cheers for improv. Thanks.
I know we only have about 9 minutes left, but I actually want to ask everyone if you see connections between loneliness and polarization, and also if you see how you see anxiety and loneliness interacting. I just kind of want to ask folks. That's something I'm thinking about, and we can of course talk about practical ways of dealing with it, insights, ideas, experiences.
I was
First,
late to this talk.
go ahead,
Oh,
Allison.
sorry, Chris. Go.
No, please go ahead.
Okay.
I want to hear your
I was going to
voice.
say, I had a session before this, and the whole topic was like loneliness and anxiety. And so I think they very much do relate. And it's hard to figure it out that they relate.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it a situation of I'm lonely and I'm anxious about doing what I might need to do in order to not be lonely? Or is it?
It's like there's like a barrier to recognizing that there is anxiety.
Yeah.
Like I see it, but
yeah.
The client doesn't.
So something Rollo May talked about was that loneliness can be like abandonment anxiety, of like, which can be, he described it as can be the most painful type of anxiety, which I was just reading up on that some recently. And because I could see loneliness could seem sad and depressed and despondent, but that there could really be an anxiety in there. And then I'm thinking about, so that's abandonment interpersonally, but what about abandonment intrapersonally too? Like, am I abandoning myself in some way? Am I abandoning what I care most about deep down? I mean, I think all the medias can really distract us from what matters most to us sometimes. I mean, at least I've experienced that, where the things that matter most to me are satisfying and difficult, and the media is not difficult. It's easy and it's stimulating.
It's too easy.
Yeah, it's too easy, and we get hooked on it. But
I was going to say something similar to dovetail. I think that loneliness can be a vacuum chamber where normalized anxiety can like reverb and distort and just become a non-reality in a way, and just become super disconnected. Just think of solitary confinement in the American prison systems, which is so backwards from the way it needs to be. If we need community and connection to get better, why are we putting people in solitude? We see how that type of punishment isn't going to work. But I thought about that, how in a vacuum, anxiety can, think about cognitive anxiety too. Like Alex, you're talking about cognitive, like distortion, distorted thinking. Loneliness just cranks that amp up.
yeah.
I wanted to make a quick comment about art and therapy. And I like what Buchenthal would say about the therapist, which is the therapist as an artist. Very often we don't envision ourselves as artists. But therapy is really about creating, and anything that is getting created involves art. And I think Olmid was saying something so fascinating, where you actually ended up creating something so beautiful. It was you doing your art and the client and you participating in that activity, and so something so beautiful and powerful comes out of it. So I believe we're all artists and we create along with our clients. That's the comment that was going on in my head.
I would just reverberate to something Alex was referring to before, which was a kind of existential vacuum. I think we're very poor in our culture at supporting people to be with the radically unknown. And I think this is also what Bralo is alluding to about abandonment. You know, that primal terror of kind of groundlessness and helplessness that we're all born with, I believe. And if we're not met in a supportive and understanding way, if we're met with fears, if we're met with a lot of covering over, that's exactly how we're going to react to that vacuum, that void. So seems to me that we need a whole lot more emphasis on enabling spaces to be without verbiage, and to connect with various parts of our body, our whole body experience. Certainly art can bring that up as well. As a kind of general theme, I was thinking about the more, being able to come into the more of who one is, rather than just identified with this one often despairing position. But that takes a supportive environment. The other piece you alluded to, Chris, was polarization, which, as you know, I find very, very engaging. And yeah, I do think it's related. I think we do have a lot of lonely people, a lot of people who are not comfortable with their vulnerability. Again, those parts that are, you might say, very soft or fragile, helpless, human. And so we do a lot of covering up and covering over, and we've got a lot of distractions for that, obviously, in the technical world, as Sushree has also brought up. But I think looking to strong arm leaders, looking to absolutist ideologies, looking to ideologies that pump us up and make us feel, greater than others, scapegoating others. These are all ways, it seems to me, of covering up a basic inability to be with the various parts of oneself. The good, the bad, and the ugly, which makes for a whole life, it seems to me.
Yeah. I can see like how coming through that lens could help, practically speaking, sometimes in the therapy room, if we have a client that's in a highly polarized state and struggling, that this terror of the unknown, or this dread of loneliness. I have a lot of ideas flying in my head there, but I don't want to ramble on. I know we only have 1 minute left. I want to point out that, I think that what we're doing here is a good use of social media. Just wanted to say, because we all got together on social media and we decided to do this. And I'm hoping, I know Alex D is has a podcast, and Chris D has a podcast, and all who's doing stuff online, and so maybe that's also something we have to offer, is bringing some of our perspectives out there in terms of connecting in a way. Anybody want to share anything you've taken from this, or anything you think we should have focused on more, or we could focus on more next time if we do a sequel, or like that. More practical stuff maybe too. Like,
Well,
what-
even on the other side of practical, I know, Alu, you're all about the practical, which I am too. Because that's one of the reasons me and him love the DBT, which can include existential stuff. It's not just behavioral stuff. It can go really, really deep.
Yeah.
Anyways, I'd be really curious about loneliness in the spiritual. I mean, if we're talking about, and I know Kirk's all into awe and thinking of awe and how important that is, and life enhancing anxiety. I'd really like to take a spiritual lens of that, in addition to the practical, because I'm always, how are we doing this? How are we doing this existential stuff?
Yeah. So Christy, I'm thinking about William James and his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And I think one of the ways he defines the divine is like, he said it's something having to do with solitude. So he does say, in solitude, your relationship to whatever you think is, I don't know if he says the highest or the largest or what matters most or is the most meaningful, like your relationship to it when you're alone in solitude. And for some reason, he includes that. So like that there's something about your intimate relationship. But I know, there's an individualism thing. I have my ear out more also for ways things are individualistic, because maybe it's also in relationship when you're with a group of others. How do you all relate together about whatever you all think is the most important, the most vitally, like deeply important, not what looks the sexiest or what's the most confident or whatever, that type of stuff. But I want to respect everyone's time, and I appreciate everyone for coming. These kind of really keep me kind of inspired and stuff. So I hope that some of you will consider doing stuff like this and inviting us. And I know some of you are, and some Alu, Christy, and I have another men's mental health panel that we're doing soon. And Christy and I are getting involved with one that's going to be about spirituality and psychotherapy. And so, yeah, got stuff in the works. Alex D has a podcast, the CR Tucson podcast. And so, yeah, thank you all for coming, and I will sign off.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you,
the
everyone.
time, Chris.
Bye.
Thanks.
Great to be
Thank
with
you.
you all.
Yeah,
Very rich.
you too.